back to the world and works of Nintendo 64 after all these years. Or at least baby steps in that direction.
There's no sense in walking around with your feet stuck to the ground.
The recent release of the Analogue 3D reminded me that, oh yeah, I never actually created a console retrospective on the N64 for N64 works. Personally, I blame society. Actually, no, it's my own fault, or at least the fault of my own hangups. N64 has always been my least favorite Nintendo console, and I'm afraid that I've let things slide for like 5 years. For me, it's the console that lost the thread of content that had made me love the NES and Super NES so much. I mean, make no mistake, at first sight, the N64 blew my mind, like it did for everyone else. I don't know anyone who was churlish enough to have seen Mario 64 running on a demo kiosk in the summer of 1996 and think, wow, this is crap. Nintendo certainly didn't invent 3D action games, but those early N64 titles had a special kind of magic that even the best releases for competing systems at the time, think Wipeout or Panzer Dragoon, just didn't quite possess. But the thing about a mic drop is that sometimes it's less a statement than a challenge to the competition. And in that generation of consoles, the competition ably stepped up to the challenge. For a variety of reasons, the torch of games that speak to Jeremy Parish passed to PlayStation that gen. Nintendo started to claw things back a few years later with the 2001 releases of both the Game Boy Advance and the woefully underappreciated GameCube. So that leaves N64 as the odd one out. A console out of step not only with its own lineage, but also with other systems of the era. To its credit, I think it's a miracle that the N64 turned out as well as it actually did. The tides of the gaming biz meant that Nintendo was due for a humbling. I can't think of any first party who has ridden high for 3 consecutive hardware generations, at least not in the console space. I mean, after the soaring popularity of Genesis, Sega fumbled the Saturn at the same time that the N64 had its run. Sony has the messy PlayStation 3 as the disruptive glitch in its best-selling run of consoles. And don't even get me started on Microsoft's decision to capitalize on the Xbox 360's momentum with a decade-long string of forced errors. As for Nintendo 64, that console came on the heels of the NES and Famicom, by far the best-selling console on 2 continents, and the Super NES, which was also highly successful, if not quite as dominant as the NES. More crucially, it landed in the midst of a massive change for tech and games, as the very definition of what a video game could be underwent a radical shift due to the plummeting prices of 3D rendering technologies. With N64, Nintendo ventured into new territory in more ways than one. Something interesting about pre-3D consoles is that pretty much every single one that I can think of ran on tested, proven hardware architectures. Just look at how many consoles made use of a ColecoVision-style combination of a Z80 processor and TI graphics chip, or something similar. The Atari 2600, NES, and TurboGrafx 16 ran on variants of the MOS 6502, previously seen in the Apple II, Commodore 64, Atari XE, and VIC-20. The Genesis and Neo Geo made use of Motorola 68000 setups, reminiscent of GUI-based home computers and bleeding-edge arcade boards. But those reliable 8 and 16-bit workhorse chips couldn't keep pace in a business where gamers had been primed to expect the most impressive graphics and performance in their entertainment. 3D computer visuals had been something of a holy ideal in Hollywood since the early 1980s, and there was increasingly a sense that video games should get in on that racket too, since their reliance on computers to run put them halfway there to begin with. Game enthusiasts looked at Jurassic Park and those Amiga demos in Babylon 5 and prayed, "Lord, I've seen what you've done for others, and I want that for myself, in real time." 3D-capable polygon-pushing graphics processors entered the realm of affordable for consumers by the mid-1990s, and we all knew it. So a console that kept plowing the same sprite-based 2D frameworks while things like Virtual Racing and Ridge Racer existed in arcades would have been disastrous. The thing is, it would take a few more years for the 3D processor race to shake out, and for manufacturers and programmers alike to settle on best practices and most effective approaches. For the first time since the primal console days of Odyssey and Channel F, manufacturers found themselves in unfamiliar territory, unable to rely on proven tech and forced to commit to 3D-capable chipsets and architectures. each of which came with distinct advantages and disadvantages. I mean, even the universal modern standard of creating 3D objects with an enormous array of triangles wasn't a given. Sega Saturn's console used four-sided objects, and some maniacs were even convinced that ellipsoid graphics were the way of the future. So everyone who sold consoles held their breath and hoped that their hardware choices panned out. Sony committed to a MIPS-produced chip that had proven itself in high-end computer workstations, while Sega made use of a Hitachi RISC-based chip called the SH2 for its Saturn. Both of those systems demonstrated unique strengths and weaknesses. PlayStation could push a huge number of raw polygons, but the system had a limited allocation of RAM, and the slow data load time of its CD-ROM media created a bottleneck that crimped just how much material the console could work with at a given time. PlayStation also involved cost-cutting shortcuts with its 3D calculations, which caused 3D objects to jitter and warp on the screen. The Saturn, on the other hand, had a complex dual-chip architecture that could be expanded with a plug-in RAM cartridge, making it an absolute monster for 2D sprite-based games. Coaxing great 3D performance from the system, on the other hand, took some doing, and few developers truly mastered the practice. Nintendo, for their part, had built their previous systems around chips manufactured by Ricoh, parlaying their existing partnerships with fellow Japanese firms and their own internal familiarity with those partners' tech and processes to great effect. But Ricoh evidently wasn't up to the task of competing in the 3D console arena, and overall development on the 6502 chip family, which had always been intended for business applications where 3D rendering wasn't really a necessity, dead-ended before making its way into the 32-bit space. So Nintendo worked with overseas companies to develop its own tech for the N64, something it also had done with the Virtual Boy's display tech, but never mind that precedent, hahaha. Ultimately, Nintendo's partnership arrived at a solution based around the MIPS R4200, a next generation of the R3000 chip that powered PlayStation. Cramming that advanced chip tech into a machine that could sell for $200 was no small challenge, and bringing the N64 to market involved making a lot of compromises. The result is a console that looks and feels weirdly alien to other tech of the era. I mean, for starters, it used cartridges. Cartridges! In the year of our Lord, 1996. Unbelievable. But yes, Nintendo took its usual protectionist approach to console management, centering the N64 around solid-state carts at a time when the rest of the industry had almost entirely transitioned to optical media. The company justified this as an attempt to avoid the enormous load times that plagued CD-ROM consoles. Which wasn't necessarily the worst argument. There truly was a sense of immediacy to playing N64 that made it feel old school in a good way. A last bastion of fat-free console gaming. In theory, it was the most powerful 3D console of its generation. Yet it loaded sophisticated games like The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask from chunky carts instead of a disc. Still, zero load times are all well and good, but let's not forget that, even disregarding the fact that a lot of N64 games ended up having effective load times while the system waited for compressed data to unpack and load from those teensy carts, Nintendo also had total control over its cartridge manufacturing pipeline. It's a big part of why they decided to carry forward their traditional publishing and licensing model, which required third parties to produce their software through Nintendo. No matter what happened with the N64 market, no matter how poorly a game sold, Nintendo would still get paid, even if the game's own publisher took a massive bath on it. Business as usual for Nintendo, really. And this decision to go with cartridges may have helped Nintendo to stay in the black. But it also hemorrhaged away support for the system, a short-term fix with long-term effects. For a lot of third parties, it was the final straw for their relationship with Nintendo, or at least put a crimp in things. Nintendo had a hammerlock on the industry in the 8-bit era, but that slipped during the 16-bit days, and both Sega and the Hudson NEC TTI conglomerate made huge strides to match Nintendo's output and win over third parties with Genesis and TurboGrafx 16, or really PC Engine. Nintendo's decision to stick with carts, which were far more expensive than CDs to manufacture yet held only a small fraction of the data, alienated a lot of partners who either had aspirations of creating games too big for carts or else had suffered significant losses in the 16-bit generation due to the Super NES licensing model. The former included Square, whose relationship with Nintendo had already grown strained by the constraints of carts in the late 16-bit era, and whose slate of games for the late 90s included visuals and videos that demanded multiple CD-ROMs, absolutely ruling out carts. The latter included Capcom, who had allegedly taken a beating in the late Super NES era on expensive carts like Street Fighter Alpha 2. When Sony swooped in with a new machine and, more importantly, a more attractive business model, the PlayStation managed to grasp the thread of continuity that Nintendo had lost hold of. All the partners who looked and salivated at the promised specs of Project Reality, as Nintendo codenamed the N64, only to find themselves revolted by the return to carts, found the Sony camp to be inviting and, more importantly, profitable for more than just the console manufacturer. Still, the N64 offered a lot of potential for anyone who could deal with its limitations. With its next-generation version of the PS1 chip, the system could produce impressive visuals. Nintendo designed the N64 around multiplayer experiences, including an unprecedented 4 controller ports on the face of the machine. Between its seamless 4-player support and mostly load-free cartridges, Nintendo became the destination for party-style experiences. Admittedly, many of these experiences boiled down to 4-player split-screen slideshows where each person focused on a quarter of the low-resolution screen, a whopping 120 lines of pixel information apiece at a silky smooth 15 frames per second. But you try to tell a bunch of college students in 1997, day drunk on Zima while they skip classes to play Smash Brothers and GoldenEye on a 14-inch TV in their dorm room, that they're not having the time of their lives? I dare ya. Oh, and the console had analog controllers. Now, this wasn't anything new. The Atari 5200 shipped with analog sticks more than a decade earlier. But unlike Atari's joysticks, the N64's sticks weren't a horrible user experience. And while Sony had its own analog controller already, that was a bizarre oversized thing, with double joysticks, best suited for flight sims, certainly not for the 3D platformers that would briefly become the biggest thing in games. Both Sony and Sega quickly brought their own pad-style analog controllers to market to compete with the N64's stick. But since neither Saturn nor PlayStation had shipped with analog control as their standard interface from the start, developers had to design for digital pads as the baseline for gameplay and treat analog as an option, or else make a lot of conspicuous noise that digital-only controllers wouldn't work, as with Ape Escape. The N64's analog controller, which also included a D-pad, guaranteed developers could incorporate either analog or digital controls into their game without fear of shutting out players using the wrong interface tech. Admittedly, that controller was, like the console itself, a bit weird and compromised. Instead of Nintendo's designers carrying forward the layout that they had pioneered with the Famicom and Super NES controllers, the industry standard adopted even by the competition, they went with a trident-shaped device. Counterintuitively, you were meant to hold this device by the center and rightmost prongs, leaving the left prong almost entirely disused, except by the handful of games that slummed it with D-pad controls. The Trident controller did allow additional flexibility for the likes of first-person shooters, giving you the freedom to use either the D-pad or the so-called camera buttons on the right side of the controller to navigate 3D space. Sadly, none of these options feel especially good to go back to today. See, Sony released the PlayStation Dual Analog controller a year later, and its dual thumbstick arrangement would become the standard for 3D console action, especially in first-person shooters. A year after that, they gave us the DualShock, which incorporated the forced feedback tech that Nintendo offered as a plugin with a socket embedded in the N64 controller. The N64 presented some groundbreaking console shooters like Turok, GoldenEye, and Perfect Dark. But once Microsoft shipped the Xbox with Halo and codified the interface principles of the console FPS, those earlier gen shooters became clumsy, even painful in retrospect. The combination of zero load times, 4-person multiplayer, and analog control by default, along with a limited storage space of cartridges, resulted in a console with a highly unique library. The developers who stuck around to work on N64, a group that sadly excluded most major Japanese companies outside of Konami, designed games specifically suited to the N64's abilities and advantages. Sadly, the greatest strength of NES and Super NES, all those fantastic third-party titles from their partners in Japan especially, barely manifested on N64. The console did get its share of interesting experimental efforts, things like Blast Corps and Mischief Makers, and Nintendo put out some revolutionary works of their own. But meaty single-player adventures were almost entirely limited to the Zelda duology, a load of mascot action titles. You can count the number of true role-playing games on N64, one of the PlayStation's most potent weapons, on a single hand. Traditional 2D action games were even less common on N64 than on PlayStation, despite the fact that Sony allegedly tried to prevent non-3D software from shipping in America. If you liked racers, shooters, sports, second-tier 3D fighters, or party games, N64 was your console. For everything else, Sony beckoned with inviting arms. For every weirdo experimental N64 success, like Space Station Silicon Valley or Blast Corps, there were half a dozen mediocre releases like War Gods or Knife Edge. Meanwhile, Sony celebrated the outlandish and unconventional by creating a line of games like Parappa the Rapper and Bushido Blade, innovative import titles that, incidentally, sold for the budget-friendly price of $40. It was a brutal blow, given that N64 carts started at $60 for first-party releases and climbed in price from there. For their part, Nintendo pushed back by promoting the raw power the console would command and touting their relationship with bleeding-edge Western tech companies like Silicon Graphics. Promotion and hype for that Project Reality began back in 1993 with tall tales of the most powerful gaming system that would ever exist. Endless, breathless previews and promises of Toy Story and Jurassic Park quality computer graphics in real time made N64 sound like the most amazing thing ever. In hindsight, Nintendo's bravado about the system comes off as a sweaty veneer, masking a troubled product. A desperate attempt to fend off another Virtual Boy flop, but this time on a vastly larger scale. This was a system whose shortcomings were signaled well before launch. Nintendo built a memory expansion slot into the console that could accept an upgrade cart to double the N64's available RAM. There was also going to be an expansion drive based on iOmega's zip disk format, which would theoretically offer a cheaper, more capacious storage format to make it competitive with CD-ROMs, the 64DD. If you've never heard of or used the 64DD, there's a reason for that. Nintendo clearly hoped the 64DD would turn out to be the second coming of the Famicom Disk System, the extremely popular add-on for the Japanese version of the NES, which used cheap, rewritable media and inspired technical and conceptual innovations that advanced the medium. The Famicom Disk System extended the life of the Famicom console and spurred developers to think more expansively about how they built games. Most of the first wave of truly revolutionary NES games owes its existence to the disk system. Things like Zelda, Castlevania, and Metroid. Even though the Famicom Disk System never came to the US or Europe, Americans and Europeans enjoyed the benefits of FDS innovations through expanded cartridge formats. It was a big deal. None of this happened with the 64DD. The 64DD shipped, but exclusively in Japan and only in small numbers. Japan never really took to the N64 as a whole, and both PlayStation and Saturn greatly outsold Nintendo's console in that region. Only a tiny fraction of the small Japanese N64 user base were moved to buy the 64DD, which has turned the add-on into a Virtual Boy-like bugbear for collectors. The company saw the writing on the wall and didn't even bother to localize the thing, quietly letting it slip into obscurity along with its library. Although we did eventually see some of its most compelling concepts on other systems, like Animal Crossing and Mother 3. Oh wait, scratch that last one. Thanks for nothing, NOA. And even when it stuck the landing, N64 still felt out of step with everyone else's consoles, even at the time. When magazines published their technical shootouts comparing the different consoles, Nintendo refused to play along by sharing the raw polygon pushing capabilities of the N64. They would only share numbers that included all of the active effects, like filtering, reflections, and anti-aliasing. This had the weird effect of skewing the N64 in print to appear inferior to the competition in terms of sheer calculations, by Nintendo's own choice. That, combined with the compromises entailed by the console's cartridge-based media, always made the N64 feel like an alien device compared to the PlayStation and Saturn. The N64's graphics looked blurrier than those of other systems, with soft edges and smeary textures, even though its on-screen objects generally looked more solid and real. The N64 didn't suffer from the shakiness of the PlayStation or the gritty sluggishness of the Saturn. Although that generation's consoles felt compromised in some way or another, Nintendo's compromises arguably made the N64 the most unpleasant console to look at, despite the excellence of its underlying 3D rendering. The smeary, blown-out textures and cataract-like fuzzy edges legitimately gave me eye strain sometimes. I've always sort of seen Sega's Dreamcast as a demonstration of what the N64 could have looked like had Nintendo not been so adamant about keeping the retail price down, or if they had been able to stick it out a few years for the tech to mature a little. Of course, it's not like Dreamcast is exactly a poster child for success, but I think a big part of why people love it is that it feels like Sega making an N64 of their own. Dreamcast visuals have a similar feel to N64's. Graphics have fewer polygons and less exciting effects than the systems that followed shortly after. but it was suited perfectly to crisp, colorful, fast-paced experiences. In hindsight, the N64 does feel like a transitional system, a half step between the PlayStation and the Dreamcast, which itself feels like a half step on the way to the PS2, GameCube, Xbox generation. But again, N64 was an imperfect system in an era in which every solution was imperfect. And in some ways, it truly was unparalleled. Like I said before, I bought the system at launch, and in those early days, its best games truly felt like a revelation. Super Mario 64, Wave Race 64, Mario Kart 64. I'd never played anything like them, either at home, on a computer, or in arcades. But after that initial wave of brilliance, the N64 just didn't serve up many games that really connected with me in the same way. The novelty of 3D wore thin, and the games often felt like slower, less attractive renditions of the templates and structures that I ultimately enjoyed more in the zippier, more responsive world of 2D. Part of the impetus behind my starting N64 works nearly a decade ago was a desire to see if I'd missed out on anything incredible by spending so little time with Nintendo's third-gen console. And I tapped out when I realized that I'd have to slog through the same releases that turned me off of the machine, all to cover games that take a lot longer to play for commentary and video capture than 8-bit titles. It's taken me a while to come around to the N64 as an interesting console that just wasn't intended for me. The Nintendo 64 is my wilderness years system, to be sure. But the N64's failures are often as interesting as its successes. So that's what N64 Works is for. It would take Video Works about 20 years to actually get to N64 if I simply went through the NES Works, Turbo Works, Segaiden chronology, which seems like an unreasonable amount of time to wait to talk about Ocarina of Time. So instead, I plan to drop N64 Works videos out of sequence from time to time here, to spice up the standard chronology. So don't worry, you didn't suddenly develop cataracts. That's just the blur of the N64's mandatory hardware-level texture filtering, baby. Anyway, a few weeks from now, on N64 Works, I'll finally get over that Killer Instinct gold-shaped hump that derailed N64 Works back in the day.